All right, everyone, I want to thank our sponsor today, Organifi. You know, we talk a lot on this podcast about healing and the healing journey. Well, an integral part of that are the foods and the drinks that we consume. I know you know this. If you're like me, you know the importance of eating healthy, but you don't always have the time or the willpower to cook with all the colors of the rainbow. Organifi's superfood blends make it easy and enjoyable to add more variety and nutrition to your day. These are delicious organic powders that you can add to water or milk, stir and drink. It literally takes 30 seconds. It is that simple. A couple weeks ago, I was right about to start a green juice fast, a kind of a short mini fast. And I kid you not, the night before, Organifi reached out to me about sponsoring this podcast. And I will tell you that I was thrilled because this is aligned with what I'm doing. I'm familiar with Organifi. I've used them in the past before. I want to be able to bring to you quality products and things that are going to promote a healthy lifestyle. Organifi green juice is the one I use. It's the one I use every morning so that I know right away I'm starting the day on a healthy note. It's loaded with vitamins, loaded with minerals, and essential antioxidants. As a listener of the Trauma Therapist podcast, you can get 21% off any item by going to Organifi.com/trauma and use the code trauma. Once again, to get 21% off any item, go to Organifi, that's Organifi.com/trauma and use the code trauma. All right, everyone, I want to thank our sponsor today, Organifi. You know, we talk a lot on this podcast about healing and the healing journey. Well, an integral part of that are the foods and the drinks that we consume. I know you know this. If you're like me, you know the importance of eating healthy, but you don't always have the time or the willpower to cook with all the colors of the rainbow. Organifi's superfood blends make it easy and enjoyable to add more variety and nutrition to your day. These are delicious organic powders that you can add to water or milk, stir and drink. It literally takes 30 seconds. It is that simple. A couple weeks ago, I was right about to start a green juice fast, a kind of a short mini fast. And I kid you not, the night before, Organifi reached out to me about sponsoring this podcast. And I will tell you that I was thrilled because this is aligned with what I'm doing. I'm familiar with Organifi. I've used them in the past before. I want to be able to bring to you quality products and things that are going to promote a healthy lifestyle. Organifi green juice is the one I use. It's the one I use every morning so that I know right away I'm starting the day on a healthy note. It's loaded with vitamins, loaded with minerals, and essential antioxidants. As a listener of the Trauma Therapist podcast, you can get 21% off any item by going to Organifi.com/trauma and use the code trauma. Once again, to get 21% off any item, go to Organifi, that's Organifi.com/trauma and use the code trauma. Trauma Therapist Podcast, episode 487. All right, guys, welcome to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. My name is Guy McPherson. My mission is to raise awareness of trauma and to support new trauma therapists just starting out on their trauma-informed journey. I do that through this podcast and my membership community, Trauma Therapist 2.0. If you're a therapist of any kind interested in learning about trauma and you're looking for support and inspiration, I invite you to check out Trauma Therapist 2.0 by going to traumatherapist2.com. That's traumatherapist, the number 2.com. All right, let's get started. All right, folks, before we get started, in this episode, we cover some intimate and possibly triggering areas of trauma and abuse. Listener discretion is advised. This episode is sponsored by Somatic Experiencing. Trauma may be a fact of life, but it doesn't have to be a life sentence. Somatic experiencing is a psychobiological method of addressing clients' physical and emotional trauma conditions and helps to give voice to their experiences without a need for them to retell their story. SE focuses on regulation of the nervous system and offers the opportunity to engage, complete, and resolve the body's instinctual responses to traumatic experiences. For more information regarding somatic experiencing and the SE professional training program, the Trauma Therapist podcast listeners can visit traumahealing.org/TTP. That's traumahealing.org/TTP. All right, folks, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist podcast. I am very excited to have as my guest today, Dr. Kelli Palfy. Kelli, welcome.
Thank you, Guy. Happy to be
All right.
here.
Thanks. So Dr. Palfy is unique in her field. She's a retired RCMP officer, which stands for Royal Canadian Mounted Police, who specialized in international sex crimes committed against children. She coordinated the RCMP's first sex tourism case, then went on to do her Ph.D. During her training, she saw a need and developed an interest in working with male survivors of sexual abuse. She's the first female author of a book dedicated solely to the topic of her research, which was why men so seldom discuss abuse. Her goal is to create awareness through shedding light on this hidden epidemic. She does this so that abused boys and men can get the support they need. Awesome. All right. So, Kelli, before we dive in here, share with our listeners where you're from originally and where you're calling from currently.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I'm a Saskatchewan girl originally, so that's one of our prairie provinces. And I am now living in Edmonton, Alberta.
Okay. Awesome. So I was before we were recording, I was mentioning the title of your book, which you have in the background there, which is titled Men Too, correct?
Yep, Men
Yep.
Too: Unspoken Truths About Male Sexual Abuse.
Awesome. So, well, let's kind of, you had mentioned the RCMP, again, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. Let's talk a little bit about that. I'm just fascinated by how someone like yourself gets into this field. Talk a little bit about that part first.
Sure. So I was a Royal Canadian Mounted Police for 13 and a half years. That's basically our equivalent to the FBI. And for the last 4 years of my career, I was working in a unit called the Integrated Child Exploitation Unit. So our mandate was to investigate sex crimes committed against children internationally. And in Canada, we had just passed some new legislation saying that a Canadian who traveled abroad for the purposes of exploiting a child could be charged as if they had committed those crimes in Canada. And offenses also included the possession, production, and distribution of child pornographic images. So we were getting inundated with files, and the unit was created in response to this. So I was there from the inception, involved in training other police departments across Canada. And yeah, so they were training me to be a subject matter expert. And at one of our training seminars, which was led by Dr. Sharon Cooper, who was a forensic pediatrician out of the US, she was teaching us. Plus, we had a guest speaker who talked about his abuse experience and why he never said anything. And it really just blew my socks off. Honestly, it just opened my eyes. And so I became very grossly aware that we have a much bigger problem than society is aware of.
Okay. First of all, I was unaware that the RCMP was the equivalent of the FBI. What got you into that field in the first place?
Oh, that's an interesting question, Guy. There's a lot of different reasons, but I kind of grew up in a bit of a dysfunctional home myself. And I think I wanted the power, I wanted the prestige, I wanted the recognition, I wanted to be heard, I wanted job security. At the time, I wanted to be a criminal profiler as well. When I joined, this was when I was watching the movie Silence of the Lambs with Jodie Foster. And, I wanted to be her, right? So
Right.
yeah, those are kind of the reasons I joined. The reasons I stayed obviously changed over the years, but
Well, pretty fascinating. So you said when you started learning about the abuse and the kind of proliferation, it kind of blew you away. What about that blew your socks off, as you said?
well, I used to do undercover work, for example, and one of the things that I did was to pose online and pretend to be a offender looking to trade images. And I'm telling you, it was insane how organized, prolific, and persistent these offenders were. Like, you go into a chat room, for example, and I would be, we would send corrupt images out or whatever, something that they couldn't open, and they would be, trying to pester me for images, or I would chat in one room, just kind of see what's going on, and then I'd switch and go to another chat room. These guys would follow me, and within seconds they would find me, and there
Oh my
was
God.
like hundreds of them. And like I mentioned, we started up our unit. That was the Integrated Child Exploitation Unit. That was initially in response to a case out of the U.S. The U.S. Postal Service, one of the workers had noticed a lot of suspicious parcels, so they conducted a joint investigation with the Federal Bureau of Department of Homeland Security, and opened up some of these parcels and discovered that they contained child pornographic images. And so they did the search warrant on where all these parcels were coming from, ended up taking down a big server and obtaining all these credit card numbers of people who had purchased these child pornographic images. And there was just, I can't remember the exact number, but I think in Canada we had like 350 people that were getting these packages, if my memory is correct. And so, we would go do a search warrant on, say, one of these credit card numbers at the person's house and seize their computer. And then we would get their computer's address book, and it would just be filled with other offenders that they would be trading images with. And sadly, we couldn't even touch those, like that address book. We did not have the manpower to deal with that. So I don't know if you've seen that movie, The Spotlight, where I think it's the Boston Globe or whatever.
No, I haven't seen that one.
Okay, well, it's where they discovered the cleric abuse, and there's one
Oh
scene
no,
where
I did see that. Yeah, I did see that.
yeah. There's one scene where they're in the library and they're doing their research, and they find this, priests that they're trying to identify are listed as either on medical leave or transferred. And then they go, holy crap, look at all of them with the same listing, right? And that was sort of like our experience. It was just like, holy crap, like I used to say it's like the drug scene in Surrey, which probably doesn't mean anything to you, but let me say it's pretty big.
Right.
Sadly.
Man, so this is just so crazy. I mean, this led to the book in a sense. Okay. Yeah. Now, the title of the subtitle of the book is Unspoken Truths
about male sexual abuse.
Yeah. And why men don't report. I mean, initially when I saw that, I was like, well, I mean, I can imagine why men don't report, but what did you find?
Yeah. And so, Guy, if I can just back the bus up one little bit, the reason I wrote this book part of the reason was because, I didn't know, why are they, if this is so prolific, research shows that 1 out of every 6 males is sexually abused to some extent prior to the age of 16. So if there's so many, I mean, in the US, what is that, 150 million people, and 1/6 of that's a lot of men, right? So why are they boys and men? So why are they not talking about it? So I wanted to know the reasons they're not talking about it, because I thought, well, if I don't know, other people don't know either. And so to answer your question, why are they not talking about it? The most common reason was fear. Sometimes it was fear of their perpetrators. Sometimes it was a trauma response, so a physiological response. Oftentimes they have memory loss because the trauma is so unbearable that their brain just literally blocks it until, unfortunately, later in life when they're more able to deal with it. Sometimes they're just afraid that, life could be worse if they report, right? For example, if an intervention isn't successful, what will happen to me? What will happen to my siblings? So half the men that I interviewed were offended against by their own biological parent. So just this reality of what would life be like if I'm not taken away from my parent. Some of them were being beaten. A lot of them were being abused by one parent, and the other parent was not available to them emotionally. So that fear was very real.
Well, I'm thinking too, if I may, maybe it's important to distinguish too between a child reporting and an adult reporting too, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
So we're talking about kids who are under the age of 16. I mean, I could totally get all those things.
Yeah.
And it's horrific and it's frightening
Hmm.
to think that it's so prevalent.
Yeah. And like that's exactly why I wanted to write this book was to, because people think, that happens out there, not here, right? But
Right.
so I wanted to give a bunch of examples so that people could start to think like this, so people could start to be aware of it, to be aware of the symptoms, to be aware of the reasons why boys and men don't talk about it. One of the things that really surprised me in my research findings was boys doing what men do, which is protect the family. So
Mm,
lots of times they're like, oh, I can't talk about this. My parents couldn't handle that. And they don't disclose. Or, my father's a pastor. What would this look like if he found out that I was abused by one of the people in his parish,
mm,
right? What would happen to his reputation? The second most predominant reason was feeling that it was hopeless. Nobody's going to help me anyways. Nobody's going to believe me. And you're right, though, we're not talking about adult men here. We're talking about little boys.
mhm.
Two of my participants, their abuse began so early, they don't know how old they were. Like it's their earliest memories.
So the research you did was qualitative? You were interviewing
Yes.
a bunch of people? Okay.
Yes.
Um, well, how did you get the interviewees?
Well, I went to a conference where male survivors gather,
Okay.
and I put up a poster. And so, in that type of environment, people are ready to talk. So I got very rich data. And I think, possibly my previous skills of interviewing and stuff may have been helpful in that time. So, yeah, so I got really rich data from that conference.
Why does this, I mean, this is I think such a general question and a crazy question as I'm thinking about it. Why does this abuse happen? Why is it so prevalent?
You know, that is a really great question, and we'd like to take comfort in thinking that we can understand that, but the reality is we know some reasons why offenders offend, but we don't know all of them. Some of them offend for reasons of sexual gratification. Some of them, genuinely sexually attracted to children. Others, not able to connect with people their own age, so they turn to children.
Hmm.
um, a high prevalence of psychopathy in the offender population. So, sort of this thrill of getting away with it. And then, of course, there's an unknown. Like I said, we'd like to think we know all the reasons, but we really don't.
Mm. And in terms of treatment, you mentioned there was a convention. I mean, I was kind of surprised to hear that. Surprised and not surprised to hear that there was a convention for male survivors. And I could imagine the journey it must take to get to a point where you're like, okay, I'm going to go to this convention where there's a bunch of
Hmm.
other guys
Hmm.
who've been abused. And I know there's not a typical journey, but w- does this in any way mirror the treatment journey or therapeutic journey that women experience? Does it? We often hear a lot of times that for women it can take years and years and years for them to disclose what's happened. What did you?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would say similar, right? Like there's a lot of similarities, absolutely, but there's also a lot of very distinct differences too. For example, women are kind of allowed to be victims. They're allowed to be
Hmm.
vulnerable and they're allowed to have those emotions. Whereas traditionally, men have been expected to be stoic and able to protect themselves and kind of always want sex, that kind of thing. There's all these myths in society that that's the way a real man is, kind of thing. And so, men are faced with a lot of barriers when they consider disclosing. Even just the consideration of disclosing is often a very long process.
Yeah, I could imagine. I mean, I've talked about being bullied as a young kid for myself, and how it took me a while to get comfortable to even talk about that.
Yeah.
I couldn't imagine,
Hmm.
uh, you know, disclosing sexual abuse, and I can totally relate to that sense that of shame. How could this
Hmm.
happen? I'm a guy. I'm a
Hmm.
man.
Hmm.
How could this happen to me? Were the perpetrators? You talked about many times it being a biological parent. Was it most often a male?
I believe, okay, in my research, you know what, I'm sorry, I can't remember and I don't have that data in front of me exactly the numbers, but there were, I want to say about maybe a quarter were females in mine. Yeah, there's different, different studies have different statistics. But the one thing I want to say is that I think the number of female perpetrators is increasing,
Hmm.
especially in the younger generation, like teenagers and stuff like that. Like I'm hearing lots of stories where female teenagers are forcing their boys to have intercourse, like, just with the premise of, if you don't, I'll tell everybody you're gay, or if you don't, I'll tell everybody you, whatever, like make up all kinds of
Hmm.
lies about them. So that kind of thing.
So in your work, do you work specifically or solely with uh, male victims of abuse?
No, because I'm also a former first responder, I actually have quite a population of first responders that I work with, and
Okay.
I've actually just recently made that decision that I'm only going to exclusively work with either first responders or male survivors of sexual abuse, because, I feel like there's lots of therapists out there that specialize in just sort of general anxiety and depression,
Hmm.
and I really, this is sort of where I focus my attention. So I do have, like, I probably have, as you know, when you're treating PTSD, it's not a quick fix. So let's
Right.
say I have 30 clients on my roster, probably six of them are male survivors, maybe eight, and the rest are police officers and ambulance and firefighters, things like that.
All right. I don't know if you follow me on Instagram or not, but when I do interviews, I usually do 2 interviews a week. I conduct 2 interviews a week. And usually I get so excited. I get so pumped up after these interviews because I get to talk to incredible people. And what I usually do is I go on Instagram and I talk about it. I want to share that excitement. Usually there's about a 2 month turnaround on my podcast, which means that they don't go live for a couple of months. And I have a problem with that. Because I want to share it. I get so excited about these things. So what I've done is I've created a membership called Trauma Therapist Plus, and it allows people for $5 a month to access these episodes about 2 months before they get published to the public. And you can also listen ad free, which is really cool. So if you're interested in that, if you're interested in listening to episodes before they get released to the general public and also listening ad free, check it out. You can access it by going to Apple Podcasts and just clicking on any of the episodes that has a plus, PLUS, before it. It's exciting. I'm excited about it, and you'll also help support the podcast. Thank you so much for being a listener. I really appreciate it. Take care. And what can you share? And I know, again, I know there's not a typical journey of healing and so forth, but do men come to you like ready to talk? Do they come to you, under the auspices of having depression or anxiety, and then things unfold? What are you experiencing?
I see both, to be honest. Sometimes, actually, an interesting fact is that a lot of boys and men do not recognize their own abuse, right? There's a lot of confusion around whether or not they were victims, because oftentimes their bodies respond favorably. So sometimes I kind of, let's say, discover it and bring it to their attention. Other times they come to me expecting to talk about it. And, one thing I encourage therapists to do is to advertise that they work specifically with, male and female survivors of sexual abuse.
Mm-hmm.
Um, because when you can advertise that, boys and men know that you expect to be able to talk about that, so it does
Mm-hmm.
open that door.
So, what are you finding in the wake of the book? Well, let me ask this first. What is your hope for writing the book? To increase
Well,
awareness?
yeah, absolutely. Like to get the conversation started, to create awareness, right? So, to create awareness, right? Like I said earlier, like people tend to think like, oh, that doesn't happen in my backyard. Well, I'm sorry, but it does, right? Um, People need to start thinking along these lines to protect their own children, to recognize males as victims, to consider that your cousin or your son or your brother who kind of went off the rails and maybe turned to alcohol or drug addiction, or even became a workaholic, maybe there's reasons for this. So to get people
Mm-hmm.
thinking like that, to support male survivors, Actually, I was listening to one of your podcasts yesterday, the Kavanaugh sisters, and
Mm.
they were talking about how, there's not really any books out there in layman's terms. And that was exactly my goal, was to put a book out there that's in layman's terms, that just gives knowledge and understanding to victims so they can make sense of their own experiences, towards, creating this understanding, towards reducing the shame that they may feel.
So in terms of, people not realizing that they've been abused, what would you say to someone who maybe is experiencing or having certain feelings or emotions that they're unsure of? How would someone know?
Well, and there's some differences in the Canadian American laws, and then of course the laws in each state. But generally, if children are not old enough to consent to sexual activity, bottom line, even if their bodies respond favorably, they don't have the mental capacity to consent because they don't know what they're consenting to.
Mm.
So, I mean, although children may engage in sex play with each other, with, for example, same aged peers or something like that, when it comes to somebody who's older, knows what they're doing, when that type of a person engages in sexual activity with someone younger who doesn't know what they're doing, now we're considering it sexual abuse. So, sort of creating that, just what I would say would, just educate them about grooming techniques, about the damage that it does, so that they can, recognize themselves as victims, in the sense that they weren't old enough to consent, they weren't mentally capable of understanding the consequences.
In terms of the people you interviewed, were there certain commonalities that you experienced or saw?
Well, definitely the fear response. That was the most common. That was one that was present in everyone. So what I was seeing, and actually I was actually quite shocked by what I saw. I actually had to consult with another psychologist who was, had been in the male survivor field for a longer time than me. um, just the body's profound response to trauma, right? So,
Mm.
as a trained trauma therapist, you're familiar with the dissociation and the multiple personality or dissociative identity disorder diagnosis. So, three of the men that I interviewed actually developed that based on it's the body's way of handling that which is unbearable. So three had that response, others had memory loss, others just, verbalized that they had such intense fear. So all of my clients had an intense fear response, which of course is understandable. But yeah, that was the biggest commonality. And then the
You
second
mean a
most.
generalized fear? Kind of an unnameable fear? Just
Um, well, a fear response in one way or another, whether it was cognitive and emotional, or whether it was their body just like absolutely burying it. Like, I
mm,
think one of my participants, I'm sorry, I'm blanking on who he was abused by. I think, anyway, he yeah, he had buried his abuse for 59 years. He didn't remember. Oh yeah, he was abused by his father. Buried it for 59 years. Like his brain just literally buried that memory, and then after his perpetrator, his father, died, poof, the memories came back to him.
oh.
Yeah.
And while that was quote unquote buried, did it manifest in, or how did that manifest? Were there other symptoms that,
Well, and like my interviews with these men was literally 4 hours, and I would be focused on the reasons they didn't disclose. But so I don't know all the answers to that, but I do
got
know
it.
that yes, he used to have nightmares, um, recurrent nightmares, same nightmares about being smothered, about being chased, that kind of thing.
Yeah, yeah. All right. So in terms of you know, kind of suggestions or advice out there for other therapists, I mean, obviously a lot of therapists listen to this podcast. What would you say to them in terms of working with men who've been abused? Well, because
Yeah,
as you know, as we said in your bio, this is a really kind of a subset, right, of a niche topic in a sense. And
absolutely.
yeah,
Well, yeah, I've got three things written down here. One would be educate yourself about the reasons boys and men don't disclose, so that you can watch for them, so that you can sort of, make that invitation um, for men, boys and men, to talk about their abuse. Actually, four things I could say. One would be, I always put out the invitation. It's in my information sheet that I give to people to fill in. Were you sexually abused? And even if they say no, I let them know that, if by chance you didn't feel comfortable disclosing that, you're allowed to change that answer, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're allowed to come to me and tell me in the future. Second, I would say, so educate yourself and make sure people know that you're comfortable. Second point would be make sure you're comfortable talking about these sensitive topics, right? So if you are not comfortable talking about, the sexual activity that took place during sexual abuse, for example, clients are going to pick up on that. So
Mm-hmm.
we have to be very comfortable. One of my participants, his father used to fist him, right? So inserting his closed fist into his anus, right? I have to be okay talking about that, because otherwise he's never going to feel okay to talk to me about it. Third thing I would say would be, don't take away someone's coping mechanisms until you replace them. So, yeah, that's something that sort of, I think one of the other questions you often ask, which I was prepared to answer, was like a mistake I made early in my career.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that would be, the mistake I made would be, I had a client who, he had had 2 heart attacks, 2 or 3, and he told me I was the only person that he'd ever told about his abuse in his whole life. And this man was in his late 50s. And I mean, I could see the physiological distress that he was in, and I knew he wanted to tell his story, right? But, you know, what I should have done was to establish his coping mechanisms um, prior to going into that deep trauma.
Mm-hmm.
So you kind of have to titrate it, which is a fine balance. But yeah, so otherwise they can become very dysregulated. Now, that's not to say that I think that people should just teach coping mechanisms and ignore the subject matter, but helping clients understand that we'll get there. We have to kind of dip our toe in and make sure that you're safe in that water before we go into the deep end.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a good suggestion, is to make sure therapists out there that they're comfortable, because I think a lot of times there's an assumption that therapists are comfortable with everything, and
Hmm.
certainly this is a real sensitive
Hmm.
topic. I mean,
Yeah.
there's no two ways about it. And let me kind of throw this back on you. I mean, when you got into this field, when you got into the RCMP, did you think you'd be talking about this stuff?
No, I mean, 10 years ago, I had no idea I was going to be a psychologist, right?
Right, right. So how has that been for you?
Fantastic. Honestly,
Yeah.
you know, I left the RCMP because of bullying and stuff. And so, to be honest, I was very afraid that I would not be happy in my new career. But I always say I didn't know I could be this happy.
Yeah. But in terms of, this subject matter and talking about this subject matter, was it something that, you know, I don't know, how was it diving in there in a sense?
I remember watching one of my bosses try to interview a pedophile, and it was very obvious that my boss was very uncomfortable with this. And I was trying to tell him, "You have to be able to talk about this because it's on his tip of his tongue, but he's not going to say it if you're dodging the subject." And so I always had that in the back of my mind, that I had to be able to talk about this stuff. But the way and I do get asked this a lot, like, how can you handle working with this? Well, I just remind myself that I'm not their abuser. I did not create this
Mm.
environment. I know that they're in pain, and I know that this trauma is in there. And I also know that they need to be able to talk about it and get it out. So I kind of focus on the process, and I try not to focus too heavily on taking on their content. So I know this horrible thing happened to them. I know that they need to be able to talk about it. And it's kind of like, when I can have this deep disclosure about their worst possible thing that happened to them, I know that this is what they need to be able to get out. So I kind of focus on the process and just, keep my eye on that I'm very glad that they felt safe enough to be able to disclose this to me, and that now they can start their healing. So that's what I really keep my eye on, and again, reminding myself, I'm not their perpetrator. I didn't do this to them. I'm just helping them heal.
Right, right. Yeah, I mean, thank God we have people like you out there who feel like that. Seriously, I
Mhm.
mean, it just reminds me of, why I started this podcast. I was working with, we were assessing and treating young kids who were showing early signs of psychosis, and again, many of whom experienced trauma, and it just kept coming up again and again and again that there's trauma, whether these kids were
Mhm.
abused or there was bullying or whatever.
Mhm. Mhm.
um, and oftentimes, most times, parents didn't recognize that as abuse or as trauma.
Mhm.
And I feel similarly in the sense that you just needed to get the word out.
Yeah.
So
Professionals are not recognizing this,
right,
right? Children falling asleep in class are getting, labeled as, poor students. Children with, learning difficulties are automatically getting diagnosed as being, learning disabled and stuff.
right,
Whereas lots of times I believe it's trauma. Like one of the things I always say is don't diagnose anything until you treat trauma, right?
right.
So, yeah, I mean, research shows that psychologists are even a lot less likely to recognize a male as a victim of sexual abuse than they are a female.
Yeah, yeah.
So, yeah.
That is a whole, I think, another topic in and of itself. And
Mhm.
my feeling is that, right, all those behaviors or the numbing or the lack of kind of explosive behaviors, they're the things that are easy to see, right, and easy to
Mhm.
identify. And it's, talking about this stuff. Let's face it, it's not easy. I mean,
Mhm.
for a lot of us, it's not easy. And I think a lot of professionals get into this field because, they want to help, they want to heal for all the right reasons. But when
Mhm.
you start introducing sexual abuse or sexual abuse
Mhm.
of a male and of a female, of course, it, there's something very um, primordial. It's something so painful, and it
Mhm.
rubs against the kind of this
Mhm.
existential life force that we have, and that
Mhm.
I think it becomes very difficult for many of us to talk about, to stomach too.
Absolutely, but, we have to control our own what we refer to as willful blindness, right?
Right,
Like, we might get a little gut instinct that says, "Ooh, is there an abuse there?" But we kinda go, "Oh, no, that's too awful, I'm not gonna go there." But we
right,
have to, like, it is so common, it is
yeah,
so prevalent right now,
yeah.
unfortunately.
All right, Kelly. Wow. I mean, this is crazy topic. I mean, I'm glad you're doing it. I just want to remind everyone that I'm speaking with Dr. Kelli Palfy. The book is Men Too: Unspoken Truths About Male Sexual Abuse. And let me just see here. Your website is peaksandvalleypsychology.com.
Yeah, my book website is kellypalfy.ca, but they're both
Okay.
my websites, yeah.
Okay, we'll have those listed up at the show notes page. Now, in terms of book recommendations, obviously we'll have your book up here. But other books you might recommend to people listening, whether trauma related or not, what would you suggest?
Yeah, actually, in my book, I have a whole page of other books that I recommend. But
Oh, cool.
since you only want me to stick to a couple, I've got a new one here that's not listed in my book that I've been reading.
Okay.
Um, Be one for psychologists who are interested in working in this area. It's by Dr. Anna Salter, called "Predators, Pedophiles, Rapists, and Other Sex Offenders: Who They Are, How They Operate, and How We Can Protect Ourselves and Our Children." And I found this very informative. Even I consider myself fairly well versed on the topic, but I've learned quite a few things from this book. So,
Really? Okay.
really enjoying that book. And then there's two books here by Dr. Sandra Paulson, which are EMDR books, Looking Through the Eyes of Trauma and Dissociation, and then When There Are No Words. So both of these are kind of they're both EMDR training books, but very, very informative. The skills that you learn in these books on how to do early childhood trauma work with victims has been very rewarding for me in my practice.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, again, it's inspiring to talk to someone like you who's kind of out there doing this work that, I mean, let's face it, we need it. We need people like you who are doing this. So appreciate you
Thank
coming
you.
on here. Yeah, you're welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been such an honor.
All right, Kelly, take care.
You too.
All right. Once again, thank you to Somatic Experiencing for sponsoring this podcast. Somatic Experiencing Trauma Institute is a 501c3 nonprofit dedicated to resolving trauma worldwide by providing professional training and education in somatic experiencing. It was founded by Dr. Peter Levine, author of the bestseller Waking the Tiger, who developed somatic experiencing based on explorations of how animals deal with threat, nervous system overwhelm, and traumatic experiences on a daily basis. Learn more about somatic experiencing and the SE Professional Training Program at traumahealing.org/TTP. That's traumahealing.org/TTP.